Thanks very much for that introduction and for the invitation to join you today. It's a real pleasure. My intention with my presentation is just to give you a little bit more about what the UN Global Compact is, and then a lot about what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are. And very happy to take questions as we go along if people want to type them into the chat. But as I understand it, we'll also have time at the end for more of a discussion. Okay, next slide. There we go. The UN Global Compact is 20 years old today. It's we launched with the Millennium, Kofi Annan. It was a vision of his to unite, I suppose, the business with the vision of the UN around a set of universal principles that could inform business. This, of course, happening at the height of globalization, as there was many headlines through the 90s of companies in a race to the bottom, as it were, when it comes to environmental and social impacts, looking for cheaper production wherever they could find it in the world, without perhaps giving enough consideration to some of the other costs of moving production there. And so the UN Global Compact was born out of the idea that there needed to be some universal standards to which business could adhere. It started with 40 companies in 2000 and quickly started to grow. Now we have 11,000 companies around the world that have signed up to the commitment. Another 3,500 non-business organizations in 157 countries, and there are 70 local networks like the one that I manage here in the UK. And we are mobilizing a global movement of sustainable companies and stakeholders to create the world we want. And we support the organizations that have signed up through a range of programming, both to try and improve their performance, but more generally, the environment in which business operates to make operating sustainably more realistic and viable. So just going back to the beginning, our 10 principles are all drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And to join the Global Compact, the head of the organization needs to make a commitment in a letter to the Secretary General, firstly to operationalize our 10 principles throughout the organization's activities, secondly to report annually on the progress towards achieving that end, and thirdly to support the wider UN development agenda. And at the moment, that wider development agenda is defined by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is Agenda 2030. It was agreed by all the UN member states in 2015 to deliver the future we want. And at the center of Agenda 2030 are these 17 goals. So what are they? That's the whistle stop. Let me give you just a little bit of background on where they came from. It's not something that was just dropped out of the sky, and I think that bit of context might be helpful to you. And for me, while we could go back all the way to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and the first beginnings of the environmental movement, for me a key moment was in 1987 when the UN commissioned a report called Our Common Future. And this is sort of the beginnings of a recognition of the connection between environment and social issues that the UN was addressing. Sustainable development has been defined in a number of ways, but for me the most compelling definition is this one on your screen from the Brundtland Report from 1987. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's simple and it's elegant, plain language, and it's absolutely spot on today, just as it was 30 years ago. The publication of Our Common Future led to further work around the 1992 Earth Summit, which had the Rio Declaration in it, furthermore a Commission on Sustainable Development, and then that led to the Millennium Development Goals that launched right alongside the UN Global Compact in 2000. 8 goals, which ranged from having extreme poverty rates to halting the spread of disease, providing universal primary education, formed a blueprint agreed to by all the world's countries, as well as leading development institutions. Beneath these 8 high-level goals were 18 more precise targets and 48 technical indicators, all developed by a small group of experts within the UN looking for what were the key buttons that they could push to improve the most lives as quickly as possible. The goals were easily understood, mostly measurable, time-limited, and relevant. They were adopted unanimously, and they were intended to run from 2000 and to be achieved by 2015. Progress towards the goals was mixed. In general, they were not achieved. However, in one respect, they were an unqualified success. They galvanized unprecedented efforts to meet the needs of the world's poorest people. The MDGs provided both a framework and a focal point for governments and also businesses on which to hang their policies and their aid programs. And it created a rallying point for civil society also to hold them to account for this. That level of success really meant it was imperative, I suppose. Even though they weren't achieved, it was imperative that there be something developed to follow on. And so at the Rio Plus 20 summit in 2012, it was agreed that sustainable development goals would be negotiated to follow on where the MDGs left off. And that leads us now to the 17 goals. Really important to note, I think, at this point, whereas the MDGs applied only to developing countries, the SDGs expanded that and applied to all countries. Where the MDGs were developed by a small group of experts within the UN, having seen the impact that they had, the stakes were substantially higher in the negotiation of the SDGs. And so that wasn't an option anymore. And so the UN embarked on a massive consultation. You may even recall that it started off with David Cameron co-chairing a high-level panel that actually toured the world to establish the broad outlines of what would eventually lead to the Agenda 2030. Literally tens of thousands of people were consulted in shaping this agenda. I mean, the ambition to define the future we want, nothing could be more important. And so now it's led to 17 goals. Beneath the goals sit 169 more specific targets. And then there are 232 indicators by which we will measure whether we have succeeded or not. The goals can be taken individually, but they are tremendously interconnected. And so any notion of cherry picking one is really not, it'd be very difficult to focus one's impacts, either negative or positive, on any one of these goals. And so that means, for example, if we looked at goal 13 on climate change, our failure to act aggressively against climate change is having profound negative impacts on our ability to achieve any of the other goals. And this is true likewise. If we make progress on gender equality, we will make progress on goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, goal 4, and so on. So that's a critical point to be aware of. Running through the whole theme of the goals, running through the ethos is really central to this agenda, is the idea of no one being left behind. And that's something we hear politicians refer to a lot. Here in the UK, talk of leveling up, talk of the Northern Powerhouse. There's tremendous inequalities in our country as well as around the world that have been particularly highlighted lately by the COVID crisis. The goals seek to address that. And I think final word on the goals in the round is that we're 5 years into this agenda. Had we made more progress towards this agenda in the 5 years we've had before the COVID crisis, we would have been in a much better position to weather this pandemic than we have been. So I'm really hoping we are going to learn from this experience, that governments are going to learn from it and ensure that the global goals are incorporated into their recovery plans. Okay, now I'd like to just do a bit of a deep dive, time permitting, into a couple of the goals. I think it's really critically important. If all you know about the goals are these icons, goal number 2 is zero hunger, you're missing out on really the goals are a bit like an iceberg, shall we say, and the tip is zero hunger. Just at the waterline is actually the full text of goal 2, which is to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So already you can see that they've necessarily had to take a lot of the essence out to make these icons more friendly on the eye. But it doesn't stop there. So the full text of the goal is critically important, but what's really important in this agenda is what's happening at the level of the targets. And so I like to show this goal 2 because I think in part, just coming from a wealthy country as we do, one might infer from seeing goal 2, zero hunger, that this doesn't apply to us. It's not really going to be a big issue here. But once you scratch the surface and get in a little deeper, you can see that in fact the scope of this is really critical. It applies in this country as much as any other, and I think goes perhaps wider than you think it would do. The first target, 2.1, is to end hunger and ensure access to food for all. So that's very clearly reflected in zero hunger. But 2.2 talks about ending all forms of malnutrition. And now we're pulling in obesity and other issues around just the way our food system is currently not sustainable in a developed country as well as elsewhere. 2.3 talking about doubling the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. This is obviously an important point on multiple levels. From a business perspective, more and more large companies are looking to using a large number of small producers to build resilience into their supply chain. But there's also a really important cultural element to that. The family farm is an essential element in most countries' cultures, and the global goals are seeking to protect that. 2.4, to ensure sustainable food production systems. 2.5, one that perhaps not many people would get to on their own just from seeing zero hunger, to maintain the genetic diversity of seeds, plants, and animals. Clearly, though, if we're looking at the future we want, that is absolutely essential, that we be thinking about that we be taking steps now to ensure that is being addressed. You'll note in the targets that it changes from 2.1, 2.2 to 2.A, 2.B. That shift is to indicate more of a shift towards process and things that need to happen in order to bring about those other targets. So increasing investment in rural infrastructure, correcting trade restrictions, ensuring the proper functioning of food commodity markets. So just again to reiterate, my objective here in sharing this with you is just to show you the breadth and depth of this agenda. I'm just going to do one more goal, good health and well-being, because I think, again, there's possibly some surprises in here, but it really, good health and well-being, the full text, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And in the targets, a number of things carried forward from the Millennium Development Goals about maternal health and infant mortality and AIDS, TB, malaria, but also adding in now premature mortality from non-communicable diseases, but now also taking a much wider understanding of well-being, addressing substance abuse, addressing deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents, health coverage for all, addressing the impacts of hazardous chemicals and pollution, addressing the use of tobacco, supporting vaccines, supporting more training and financing for health in the workforce. We could go through every one of the targets this way, and I think you would be impressed at what you would see. Oh, I even included another one. So this is probably the most commercial of the goals, or at least it can be on the surface. Decent work and economic growth to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. There's a lot loaded into that language around decent work for all, that doesn't just mean this is a blindly pure growth corporate agenda. It's qualified growth insofar as we want that growth to come from heightened economic productivity, greater resource efficiency, decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation, productive employment, decent work. So now we're talking about living wage and equality of pay for men and women and for people of all races. We need to reduce the proportion of youth not in employment. We need to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery. We need to protect labor rights. These things are all built into this agenda. Pause for breath. So I would hope that this is a meeting of ethical reading, and we talked about in the title about this being an ethical agenda, and I hope that it's evident from just what I've already shown you that there is a significant ethical component to this. It's very much about identifying what is the right thing to create the future we want. So maybe the answer why we should care has already been answered. A few slides perhaps just to illuminate it a bit more. And now I usually present this in the context of presenting to business. And so I would be presenting this in the context of why business should care about this. But I think it's perhaps relevant to you as business people or as individuals. And so starting with the Prime Minister, you will note his lapel pin. That is, in fact, the Global Goals symbol. If there's any doubt, we've not heard a lot from the UK government about this agenda, but rest assured, they are aware of it. The UK has signed up to these commitments along with every other country in the world. This agenda is already influencing public policy and will continue to do so in the future. Therefore, it would just be astute, I think, for any business person and any citizen to be familiar with this agenda, because it is coming. Mark Carney's headline referring to it's actually referring to the climate change movement and something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, a voluntary initiative calling upon companies to be more transparent about the risks to their business of climate change, and basically saying if companies don't respond to that request to act voluntarily, something will be imposed upon them. The headline about Uber, stripped of their London license to operate due to a lack of corporate responsibility. That is a dream headline for someone like me, ensuring job security for life. What it really illustrates here is a business that felt these issues were non-financial and therefore not so important and not something that they needed to really be paying attention to until they become highly financial, because their very license to operate has been jeopardized because they've not been looking out for some of these other issues. I think this is true across the whole SDG agenda. Companies need to be watching. Governments need to be watching. And the next one really highlights that. Those women are not protesting Amazon from the outside. Those are Amazon employees demanding that the company they work for do better. The next, the crowd shot, that's Extinction Rebellion on the streets of London. And the last one for G4S taking a significant hit from their investors because of perception that their performance on human rights was not adequate. What I'm getting to here is it's not a voluntary agenda. There are movements out there, investors, regulators, employees, and the population at large that are demanding ever more vocally that we move in this direction and adopt this agenda. For business, it's a pro-business agenda, so I actually don't expect there to be much resistance generally there. Research done shortly after the goals were adopted showed a potential for US 12 trillion in new business a year coming out of the transformation in society that the goals call for. At a macro level, the goals call for a better educated and more productive workforce, economic and political stability, more fair and just societies, climate resilience. These things are all pro-business. At a micro level, it makes businesses more attractive for investors and customers. It helps with management of the supply chain. It improves access to public procurement and investment. It improves competitiveness in hiring. And as we saw from the Uber headline, it impacts on a license to operate. Every business at an individual level should be addressing this. And I think one of the key takeaways here is that point about hiring. It's growing ever more clear that young people today are putting a greater priority on purpose in their work. And frankly, making rich people richer is not a purpose that captures the imagination of many young people. Companies that want to hire the best and the brightest need to demonstrate they're doing more than just send great returns to shareholders. They need to be showing a positive impact on the world so that their employees can get some satisfaction from the contribution they're making. That difference in being able to hire the best is going to make all the difference in the world going forward to the success of an enterprise. How can you contribute? The Global Compact has put forward a tool alongside a couple of other big organizations, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Global Reporting Initiative. We've done a lot to promote this and try to explain how this tool can be useful for business in integrating the goals. And we've got some webinars here that you're welcome to go have a look at if you're from business. If you want a little bit more information about how the goals are being adopted here in the UK, last year the UK government presented to the UN its voluntary national review of progress towards the SDGs. That is available to you on the government website. The UK's Office for National Statistics is one of the very best organizations in the world for gathering information about our progress towards achieving the goals. And now, I think still quite current, although starting to approach its best before date, is a fantastic publication called Measuring Up that was produced by UKSSD in 2018 that sort of established a baseline for where the UK was at in terms of achieving the goals and a strong call for action for more progress there. That's all I've got for you today. There are lots of resources available that I will share with the team at Ethical Reading, and they may distribute some links along with any follow-up from this. So I'll say thanks for your attention and hand over to Jill at this point, and I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Okay. No. So thank you so much, Steve. That's really clear, really helpful, and absolutely a bird's eye view, and absolutely really explains, why Ethical Reading got started. In addition to the view you have, I guess our additional perspective is that there's a lot of personal responsibility involved. It can't all be done top down, that quite often you actually need people to change their values and culture before they can actually make these things happen. But actually I wanted to lead off the questions, unless I can see a hand anywhere, or nothing in the chat box, no hands, because I wanted to ask you about the effect of COVID, whether the world as you see it is being disrupted by COVID, or whether you think that you're working at a level where actually the principles still stand. What do you think?
I think the goals are more relevant than ever, and just reverting to that point about some of the failings highlighted by the COVID crisis, and particularly right here in the UK, I think it's fascinating to see how the definition of an essential worker has been redefined by this crisis. Pre-crisis, nobody gave much thought to how delivery workers were paid, or people working in supermarkets. It's, I think, well established that perhaps nurses and others supporting the NHS were not being compensated as well as they might be. But it really came to a head as we were all trapped in our homes, and the only link to the outside world was via our computers and our delivery drivers, or the brave people that were continuing to work in retail to keep things turning over. That was telling for me, and I'm disappointed that we've not seen more action in that regard as part of the recovery. Inequality was evident from the different impacts that the virus has had on different communities, recognizing that the Black community, more severely impacted, typically experiencing worse outcomes if infected than white. The thinking here, this is just the culmination of years of systemic discrimination against other communities. These are all things that need to be addressed, and that's solidly represented in the goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But a huge setback, obviously. Investment is required to achieve this new agenda, and the massive hit to the economy is going to make it more difficult to find the resources to make those investments that were needed. So to your point, even more onus on individuals to step up, recognize what aspects of this agenda are aligned with your own values, and how can you translate your own behaviors to support this agenda.
Yes, absolutely. Because there is a lot of speculation that the economic effect is going to weaken governments, and therefore governments' ability to do things, putting more emphasis on back to individuals. And it's interesting times. I haven't seen anything on the chat as a question, and because the screen can't take all the participants, the only way, okay, somebody's been brave enough to put a chat on, okay? What have we got? Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Okay. Now, Steve has very comprehensively, incorporated the goals and highlighted the UN goals. But I fear the only thing that makes it distinguished or sustainable is the ethical part of it, which goes beyond domestic laws, etc. So, I mean, unless there is a strict adherence to ethical values, perhaps, just determining and formulating goals would not serve the purpose. So my submission is that UN, if it wants that all the nations should, follow these things seriously, the means that they should adopt should be ethical, and that's how we will be able to distinguish this with any other common goals. That is my submission.
Any comments, Steve?
I'm often asked to compare or explain the connection between the UN Global Compact's 10 principles and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think Mr. Mishra has hit on that. Distinction is between principles and goals. And our 10 principles existed before these goals and will continue to exist after the goals have been achieved. And I think that really is our approach to this. By approaching this agenda from a principled position, that we will eliminate discrimination, that we will respect the environment and human rights, the actual steps needed to achieve the goals start to fall into place more clearly. So I think they can't be separated. I mean, bearing in mind the UN has established through its many treaties some principles and values of that institution that companies have at least given lip service to. And I think it's absolutely right that we need, first of all, to get that ethical component correct and get people recognizing that we can't be simply pursuing our own self-interest. This future we want is a collective one, and by us all working towards achieving it, we will all be better off in the long run. But the ethical piece around eliminating inequality I think runs through the whole agenda very, very clearly, along with many other important principles.
Okay, and I think Brad had a question, and there is also a couple of questions on the chat box. So, Brad, if you could go first, and then maybe Steve,
yes,
you could have a look at the two on the chat box.
I really enjoyed that, Steve, and I learned a tremendous amount. Thank you very much. So let me jump in immediately with my question. I was struck by I guess I am struck by the disparity between the unanimity with which countries have signed up to this and the apparent unwillingness of some countries to do anything to promote it, as far as we can see. And more generally, I guess a lot of this, to some extent, predated the populist movements that we've seen over the last 10 years or so, many of which are led by people who don't seem to committed to these goals, and some of those people are actually leading countries. So I was hoping that you could comment something on the sort of fracturing of consensus over the last 10 years and how you think that might inhibit ability to move forward.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, that is a challenging question, and certainly something that all of us interested in this agenda, and not the global goals, but also more specifically the Paris Accord and the climate change agenda, both of which made 2015 a real high point in progress in this regard. These populists have managed to divide. I mean, it seems wild. Certainly in the American context, managed to parlay a minority of citizens into giving undue power to perspectives that are not popular, and yet are driving the agenda in that country. And we're seeing that in other countries, in Brazil, in Russia, in Hungary, Turkey, another example where the leadership, while labeled as populist, probably don't represent a majority. And it is very difficult. Your point that we've not seen the level of support we would like for this agenda is absolutely right. The adoption of this agenda has been mixed across the world. Some countries have committed to it really quite wholeheartedly. They've created new ministries within their governments to coordinate action across. They've adopted this agenda as government policy, and it is central to the way they go forward. And it's even elevated above the political fray. In Finland, the Ministry of Sustainable Development survives changes in regime. It's recognized as, kind of going back to the slide with all the photos on it, as inevitable. And it's really, the question is not whether or not to go down this path, but rather what is the best way to proceed? Where do we start? Which of these important goals do we prioritize? I think this may well be where it starts coming back to personal responsibility. Global Compact has has an idea that they've presented in the context of climate change, what's called ambition loops. And the idea just being that if we could raise corporate ambition in the area of climate change, that will then empower governments to be more ambitious, because clearly they're often constrained by a perception that they're oppressing or imposing too much regulation on business. If we can get business to raise their ambition and say, yes, we're going here, we're going net zero by 2030, well, the government's stuck at 2050. Well, if enough businesses say we want to be net zero by 2030, that will empower the government to start saying, well, maybe 2045. And then if the government steps up to 2045, more and more businesses will pile in. It's almost an embarrassment for companies to be merely compliant with regulation. Most leading companies want to be more ambitious. And so now that 2050 target is merely compliance. It's incumbent upon companies to step up. Well, I think we need to extend that way of thinking in a couple of different directions, more widely beyond just climate change, but to everything else. If we consider gender equality, the current rate of change in achieving wage parity and closing the gender pay gap, we're looking at about 280 years before we reach an elimination of a gender pay gap. The global goals call for gender parity by 2030. So if we're thinking about a target, about ambition within a company, or even at a personal level, where there's a target for everyone to adopt, let's just get on with it and adopt that. And I think this is where the next idea around ambition loops is, I've talked about business raising the ambition with government. Why don't we bring consumers into the argument and employees into the argument? If consumers start demanding more of the companies that they spend their money with, that's going to empower those companies. And again, it's all made up of individuals. And I work with individuals typically working within a sustainability department of a company. And they are just a lone actor. Sometimes they have a team, but they're trying to be a change agent within this big company that has all sorts of other pressures upon it. Regulators, other consumers, investors looking for returns. They're looking for levers that they can push upon that will convince senior management within the company that this is the right direction to go. There's no stronger lever than consumers saying, do this or we're going to go shop elsewhere. So this is where us as individuals can really start to shift things, and to think that our influence is small is really a cop-out, because it's not just your influence on that company, it's the influence on the people around you. And if we all show some leadership in doing things like biking to work, eating less meat, if you're having people over for dinner, 5 people over for dinner, why not have a meal with no meat, demonstrating that it's possible, and showing just one of the small things that everybody could do to reduce their carbon footprint and make the world more sustainable. And there you've influenced people, not just the store where you didn't buy any meat from, but potentially showing your circle of acquaintances that actually this is a change that doesn't hurt, that they could try as well, and we could all get on board and make this into a movement. Now, I feel I've gone so far away from your original question that I'm not sure if I ever actually managed to answer it, so I hope that I did. But if there's a follow-up, happy to try again.
Well,
I thought it was a terrific answer. Thank you very, very much.
Okay.
and if you could then pick up the 2 questions on the chat, which I think talking about the attitudes of people, particularly in a nation state setup or in a cultural setup, because of course, the world is made up of all sorts of places. It's not a homogeneous world. So, your thoughts?
It has been noted repeatedly since before the book goals were adopted in 2015, the explicit absence of the word human rights in any of the goals or targets. And that is unfortunate, but it is very clear in the subtext that that is an important thread that runs through this whole agenda. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that every country in the world signed up to this. And so that inevitably means there had to be some compromises. And nobody wanted it to be 17 goals and 169 targets. It's such a huge agenda. There was all sorts of pressure to let's get it back closer to the 8 goals and 48 targets from the MDGs. It is a huge, complex agenda that manifests itself with different priorities in different parts of the world. To be able to reach a consensus around this agenda was an extraordinary political achievement. It does little to comfort an Arab citizen, an Egyptian citizen, but I think nonetheless, it does build pressure on those governments to start aligning with this global agenda. It gives something that activists within those companies can point to as a global consensus. They can point to the commitment that their government has made to this agenda, and hopefully, if not from within the country, from outside the country, push for some accountability in that regard. As to the question before that in the chat about the gap between rich and poor, yep, I guess it's true. It's extraordinary how the citizens in this country and so many others seem to vote contrary to their own economic interests, and I don't have an explanation for that. Here in the UK, there's a very strong organization called the Living Wage Foundation that oversees a kite mark where a company can be accredited as a living wage employer. It's not difficult to do, and I think it's something that we need to start demanding of the companies that we do business with. It's just not hard, and you can see that living wage logo there. I think there we go. Thank you very much, Dave.
Well done.
And likewise, I'm the UN Global Compact Network UK is a living wage employer. We feel this is an area where very, very clearly a business needs to put its money where its mouth is. To profess to care about this agenda and not be a living wage employer is, I think there's some hypocrisy there that everybody needs to take on. I think we have a big problem with our government, and I am hoping we will start to see a convergence between the national minimum wage and the living wage. And of course, not just in the UK, but we need to be projecting this down through supply chains so that the companies we purchase from, if they're sourcing product from Bangladesh, from India, from Vietnam, they're not relying upon the legal escape that they're paying a minimum wage when everyone knows that the legal minimum wage is not adequate for their workers to live on. And I think these are steps, again, that we can make a difference with.
Yes, I think that's a really good point to end on, because what really is one of the things behind ethical ready is the fact that conformance to the rules is quite often not enough, because the world has got more complicated and people have to make decisions. And that's where it's yes and. Yes, of course, there are rules and guidelines, but people need to take responsibility quite often. So I thought that was a tremendous tour de force, Steve. I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And hope to be in contact again.